So yeah, where I left off was basically I'm a tree planter who's come out here for the last 9 summers, and over that time on the few opportunities I had to go to church, I started showing up at the Fellowship Baptist Church, and through that time I got to know Brian, and he started throwing it out there that since I'm pursuing ministry that he'd like to get me up in the pulpit. And so 2 years ago I did the same thing. During COVID, some of you saw a sermon I did for my church back in Coburg, and now I'm up here again because we just finished another season of tree planting and this window worked. So I also say that as a heads up that I cannot avoid throwing in some analogies and illustrations that will relate to tree planting. Hopefully they will still be understandable for you. We got a couple tree planters here that at least those will hit on, Kevin and Stefan. Our passage for today is Psalm 143. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to that, and I'll give you a moment to turn there. But before I get into it, I just want to start us off with a brief word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and also just to come before you and ask for your help and guidance during this time. I just ask that your Spirit would help every single person here to hear and understand your word, that you would help me to express it clearly, and that your Spirit would really be working to apply it to our hearts and affect us so it's not in one ear and out the other, and that it actually affects the heart and life. And Father, I just pray that your Spirit would guide, that you would be honored and glorified through this message. And I just give this time into your hands, and thank you again for your love, especially through your Son, Jesus. And I just pray it all in his name. Amen. So, before we read the chapter, some of you might know the story of the writer of this psalm, David, and others may not. So I'm going to begin with a brief summary of his story because it's out of the context of his story that he's writing this psalm. So, long ago, God chose for himself the nation of Israel as the people through whom he would display himself to the world. And the first king of that nation was Saul, who lived about 1,000 years before even the Roman Empire. So we're talking a long, long time ago. And he started well, but he quickly started going his own way and disobeying God. So God had his prophet go and anoint this boy who would eventually replace Saul as king of Israel. And God was with this boy. His Spirit was with him in a powerful way, and he excelled in everything he did. He became a great musician, so great that even the king heard about him and hired him and brought him into the palace to be his own personal musician. And then when an invading army came, the Philistines, to try and attack Israel, they had this enormous giant of a champion who terrified everybody except for this boy, David. So he stood up to the giant and defeated him, basically saving the entire nation from this invading army. But all his success led to a lot of fame and renown with the people, and the king started getting jealous, and so he started sending him on dangerous missions trying to get him killed. But it backfired. David kept succeeding, and he just kept adding to his fame and adding to his popularity. So finally, in a fit of rage, Saul tried to kill him himself. Didn't work out. He threw a spear and missed. But David, after that, fled and went into the wilderness to get away. And Saul then got his army together and started a manhunt for David. So David was forced to abandon his family, his friends, everything he'd ever known, to constantly running for his life, having to hide in caves, and eventually a band of misfits started gathering around him, and he became their leader. And he used this force of men to still try and help Israel, the kingdom, whose king was trying to kill him. So he was kind of like a Robin Hood type figure. But his times in the wilderness weren't as merry as Robin Hood's. He was constantly feeling the pain of his circumstances, the loss of his family, his friends, his familiar settings, having to run away, hide in caves, live in isolation, something we can more recently relate to a little bit more. And it was most likely in this time period of his life when he's running and hiding that he wrote this psalm. And it's actually a prayer to God. So I just want you to have all this in mind as we read this, so you can empathize and understand where David's coming from when he wrote this. So, Psalm 143. Lord, hear my prayer. Listen to my cry for mercy. In your faithfulness and righteousness, come to my relief. Do not bring your servant into judgment, for no one living is righteous before you. The enemy pursues me. He crushes me to the ground. He makes me dwell in the darkness like those long dead. So my spirit grows faint within me. My heart within me is dismayed. I remember the days of long ago. I meditate on all your works and consider what your hands have done. I spread out my hands to you. I thirst for you like in a parched land. Answer me quickly, Lord. My spirit fails. Do not hide your face from me, or I will be like those who go down to the pit. Let the morning bring me word of your unfailing love, for I have put my trust in you. Show me the way I should go, for to you I entrust my life. Rescue me from my enemies, Lord, for I hide myself in you. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your good spirit lead me on level ground. For your name's sake, Lord, preserve my life. In your righteousness, bring me out of trouble. In your unfailing love, silence my enemies. Destroy all my foes, for I am your servant. So David is in dire circumstances, and all he has left is God. He has had to leave everything else. And yet, from the tone of this psalm, it seems like even God feels absent. It's possible that the loss of this support structure might have been part of what damaged his sense of God. He's in a dark night of the soul, so to speak, where he can't even seem to sense God's presence. Therefore, that is the focus of this prayer. So, I'd like to title this sermon, When You Can't See the Sun, in an analogy sort of sense. Our goal today is to better understand this prayer of David so that we can learn from his example for when we are in circumstances similar to these and can't sense God's presence. I'd like to break down our examination of this text into 3 parts. First, we'll look at the foundation of the prayer, what's underlying it. And then next, we'll look at the goals of the prayer, what he's trying to achieve through it. And then finally, we'll look at his method of prayer, how he hopes to get there. So, first, let's focus on the foundation of this prayer. I believe the foundation of this prayer is faith. And I'll let you know, I'll give you my argument for why I believe this is true. If you look in Hebrews 11, many here know that's the chapter that's all about faith. The first verse says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence or conviction of things not seen. Let me just repeat that. So faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And then if you jump to verse 6 in that chapter, it says, without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, 1, and 2, that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And that's exactly what we see here. Throughout the entire prayer, David is assuming that God exists. And he's also assuming his ability and willingness to help him. David isn't saying, God, prove you're there. He already has this faith. The conviction in the existence of the God he cannot see or even right now sense. More than this, he's earnestly seeking him, which assumes that God is willing to hear him. You can see this in verses 1, hear my prayer, listen to my cry for mercy. And then again in 5 to 7, I remember all the days of long ago. I meditate on all your works and consider all that your hands have done. I spread out my hands to you. I thirst for you like a parched land. Answer me quickly, Lord. We won't pray to a God that we don't believe exists. And we won't pray to a God who we don't think it cares for us. We need to have faith in these things to come to him in prayer. The faith must first be there that these things are true. And David's faith in God is even more remarkable considering his circumstances. It looks like everything's going wrong, that God's not in control. He can't sense God. He doesn't feel like he's there, and yet he still maintains that it's true. And that he feels that way, I believe, is evident in particularly two places. So in verse 6, he says, I thirst for you like a parched land. So he's, by analogy, God is his water, and if he's parched, he doesn't have that water. He's thirsty. So by extension, he can't sense God. It doesn't seem like he's there. And then again, it says, where it says that he wants him to see his face. Verse 7, do not hide your face from me, which seems to indicate that his face or his presence is hidden. This is why I'm using this analogy of not seeing the sun. Just as we can enjoy the warmth of the sun on a clear day, like we've had many of those recently, David has experienced the joy of God's presence, the bliss of his blessings. But right now that's gone. It's like it's been many days of cloudy gloom. And he has that sort of depression that comes sometimes for us in the winter when you haven't got enough sun exposure and you get seasonal affective disorder syndrome, which this is a sort of spiritual seasonal affective disorder syndrome. So just as we long for the sun in those seasons, David is longing for God. But notice that just because he cannot see God, he doesn't despair of his existence. When we don't see the sun for many days, we don't assume that it doesn't exist anymore. As David does, we remember the days of old when the sun was shining down and have faith that it will shine once more. But emotionally in those seasons, this is very hard. When we have an overcast season of our soul, it is difficult to maintain that faith, and we want to hide that struggle. I chose this psalm because this has been my experience over the last year. I was part of a church for 9 years, my entire time coming out here, and they became my closest community. They were basically my family. But a conflict happened a year ago, and I had to leave over it. And because some people, I wouldn't agree with some people, and I left, and they didn't like that I left, even after I left, they decided to put me under church discipline. And it kind of put an awkwardness and a tension on all these relationships I'd invested years into, and ended up very alone from that. So that's what brought me to this chapter. As a result, I too was cut off from my closest friends, and it's remarkable how much it can handicap your experience of God. Ever since then, it's felt like God's presence has been hidden. But I don't believe I'm unique in this experience. And David, at least, is proof of that here. The Bible tells us that he was a man after God's own heart. And yet here, and in many other Psalms, if you look, Psalm 42 is one of the most blatant ones. He feels far from God. And he's not the only one in the Bible. Jesus himself went through the same thing. Remember on the cross what he said? My God, why have you forsaken me? Do you really think that the Father forsook his own Son? But at the same time, he went through the very real and human experience of not being able to sense God's presence, of feeling forsaken. And in those seasons, we might ask, why? Why would God let me go through this? Why isn't he there for me? The truth is, he is. Our experience and reality are not the same thing. Even at night, the sun is still there, warming the earth and preventing it from dropping down to unlivable freezing temperatures. And God is still there, even when we can't feel him, keeping us alive, providing blessings that we overlook, and even sustaining our faith. It's hard. You feel like you aren't a real Christian. You feel like a fraud. You don't want to talk about God because it feels insincere. It feels fake. But I'm starting to believe that it's the perfect time to talk about God, because he's better displayed in our weakness. Faith is not experience. Faith leads to experience. Remember that verse in Hebrews. Faith is for what is not seen, not what is seen. There are times when the muscles of faith, like in the gym, have to be broken down so they can be rebuilt stronger. If God had truly abandoned me like I felt like for the last year, then I would still be a Christian. Yet somehow, I am. It can't be me sustaining me. Somehow I still believe that, as Annie puts it, the sun will come out tomorrow, whenever tomorrow is. I say all this to illustrate the type of place that David is coming from in this prayer. Nevertheless, he continues to stand firmly on the foundation of faith in his approach to God. Maybe you don't have this faith. Maybe you've never had this faith. Then ask God. You need to start somewhere. Even in the asking, there is some measure of faith, which will lead to more faith. Prayer needs faith, but faith also needs prayer. So, this is the foundation, what underlies the whole of David's prayer. But now let's move on to the next phase. Let's look at the goals of his prayer. And I believe that these can be broken down into three categories, which I'll use a little bit of alliteration for. Deliverance, direction, and the deliverer. The desire for deliverance is most clearly seen in verse 9. Deliver me from my enemies, O Lord. In verse 3, he describes how they have pursued his soul, crushed his life, and caused the darkness to come over him. We may or may not have actual physical enemies. We live in a remarkably safe environment here in Canada. But there is an enemy, Satan, who's always operating behind the scenes and seeking to cause harm in our lives and to keep us from God. And for all of us, we've had circumstances that crush us and cause us anxiety and depression. So we can still relate to what he's going through, even if it isn't quite as literal. And it's natural for us to seek deliverance in those situations. In coming to God with these difficult circumstances, David is recognizing his weakness and God's strength, rather than relying on a do-it-yourself approach. It's our natural impulse most of the time to just, when there's something goes wrong, we want to fall back on a purely pragmatic way to fix it, rather than reaching out to God in prayer. Not that we should do nothing, but that we should do it in God's strength, because we are infinitely stronger in his strength. So, David first sets an example for us in how he reaches out to God in prayer for deliverance. Next, he seeks direction. Verse 8 lets me know the way, that says, make me know the way I should go. And then in verse 10, teach me to do your will. Let your good spirit lead me on level ground, which I can't help but think of in tree planting terms. It's like David is stuck in circumstances that parallel perilous, uneven, steep slopes covered in slash. He's asking to be led in the path that leads out of the gnarly forest of his circumstances to soft, open ground free of obstacles, to the cream as we put it. Level ground is not always easier circumstances, though. It's the way it's used in the Bible. It's a way that avoids foolish decisions and their consequences. It's the right way. It's the better way of wisdom. It's God's way. David, in asking for this, is acknowledging God's infinite wisdom and that he knows a better way of doing things than David could possibly do on his own. This is another act of humility which leads to wisdom. When I started tree planting, when my foreman was teaching me how to plant a tree, I disagreed with certain things I was told and even tried to correct certain things which I thought were wrong. Not the best way to learn. And my foreman basically left me to my own devices so I could figure things out for myself, which served me right. And as I went through this process, I ultimately discovered the wisdom of what I was being told in the first place if I had just listened. And I tell you this story because I think that this is how we too often respond to God. The advice he gives us through the Bible does not always appeal to us, so we do things our own way, leading to countless mistakes and regrets, which we could have avoided if we had just listened in the first place. Often we never figure out the wisdom of his instruction. We just go our own way and constantly repeat these mistakes. But if we're fortunate, we eventually do come to a place where we find that he does know what he's talking about and his instruction is meant for our good. Too many of us consider the Bible a rule book to restrict us, when actually it's a gift of wisdom meant to help us flourish as humans living in God's world, and God knows how to flourish in his own world. As a response to his circumstances, David cries out to God for the wisdom not just to get out of his circumstances, but also to live as God would have him to. He doesn't just want to get out of his particular circumstances, he also wants to live a life that avoids the hidden pitfalls of folly. Now, we come to the final goal of this prayer. David doesn't just want deliverance, nor even just direction. He also wants the deliverer himself, God. You can see this in verse 6. I stretch out my hands to you. My soul thirsts for you like a parched land. This is the most important goal of this prayer. What good is deliverance or even direction if you don't have God? Another crisis will come up again, and wisdom that doesn't lead a person to God is not actually wisdom at all. It's wisdom in as much as it leads to the deliverer. God is the goal behind the goals because he is the source of them. I want to repeat that. God is the goal behind the goals because he is the source of them. Yet, too often, we call out to God in a foxhole only to ignore him when we feel safe. I'm sure most of you have had that kind of person that reaches out to you only when they want something. They're your best friend when they need something, but ignore you the rest of the time. But that's what we do with God. We want his benefits without the responsibility of a relationship. But it doesn't work that way. If we want God's help, then we should seek God himself. Let me try to create an analogy that maybe will show the hierarchy of these different goals. So, let's say you're wandering in the woods and you come across a mama grizzly bear with cubs. It's a bad situation to be in. And your first impulse is, I want to get out of this situation. That's the one thing I want. What would help the situation is maybe if you have, what did I call it? I'm going to drop that page, but that's okay. Direction. No, it's not. It's deliverance. We want deliverance from that circumstance. Now, let's say we have a handheld radio with someone who knows what to do on the other end. That could be like direction. So it at least improves the situation. It doesn't mean we just get out of it and let's say we run into another situation and get lost. We have direction. But how much better would it be if that person on the other end was actually there, let's say a well-experienced guide with a gun? Now all of a sudden, the circumstance doesn't matter so much. You're safe. That person knows what to do. They have the means of handling the situation. And, it would be nicer to get away from the bear, but it doesn't matter as much. And that's kind of like having God there. He is superior to getting out of that bad situation, and he's superior even to the advice and wisdom he can give. So these are the different goals that David is seeking in his prayer. So we've examined the foundation of the prayer, faith, and the goals of the prayer, deliverance, direction, and the deliverer. Now, what is the approach of this prayer? Well, it's a well-formed argument with reasons why God should respond, which kind of sounds a little strange probably to many here, and it would have sounded very strange to me not too long ago, because growing up I never learned about this way of praying, that idea of making a well-reasoned argument to God. But now that I'm aware of it, I see it all over the Bible. It's not that God won't take pity on a poor, not well-formed prayer without any good reasons. He's generous and gracious, and he might answer that prayer, but he has set it up so that many answers to prayer require a well-reasoned argument. It's like God's a parent asking his child, why should I give this to you? If we can give him a good reason, then he won't be unreasonable. He'll actually be very generous because he is a loving father. So we should figure out the reasons for our requests. And often in that process of figuring out our reasons, we start to understand why he might not give it to us, because it might not actually be good for us, and what he actually wants is our good, not just to give us what we want. So, as strange as it may sound, we can actually use this psalm as a lesson in how to argue with God. So, how does he frame his argument? He says, in your faithfulness and righteousness come to my relief. So he's appealing to God's character, saying you're faithful, you're righteous, so answer me. And that initially might sound like a good argument, but upon thinking about it, I actually don't think by itself that does David any good. Because, and it's really clear in the next verse, he says, David says, don't put me on trial because no one's righteous before you. We often think that because God is good and righteous, that is beneficial to us. But by itself, that's actually the worst thing, because we aren't good and righteous. We don't measure up to the standard of righteousness. We might measure up to our own standards, but we don't get to set those standards. We aren't the creator. We aren't God. And none of us have ever lived up to God's standards. So him being good and righteous means what that means for us is we deserve punishment. So by itself, that does not help David. After he says, please don't put me on trial, I know I'm not going to measure up, in fact no one will, then he says, but my enemies, they're pursuing me. I'm crushed to the ground, I'm dwelling in darkness. And what seems to be going on here is he's saying, I'm about as low as I can go. Things are about as bad as they can be. So don't make it any worse. It's already bad. Now, how does this argument actually work? How does it help him? And I think that where it falls into place is clearest in verses 9 and 10. He says, rescue me from my enemies, Lord, for I hide myself in you. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. So it's actually the relationship that David has with God that changes things. Now, I didn't see this till just this morning when I was looking over the passage again, but look at verse 2. He doesn't just say, don't bring me into judgment. There's something else there that is easy to brush over, but I think it's actually really important. He says, do not bring your servant into judgment. He is God's servant. He has a relationship with God, and that relationship allows him to plead with God. Now, how can David have this sort of standing with God? God's righteous, David isn't, nor is anyone else. How can this relationship exist? And it's because God, I said at the beginning, God chose Israel to be the means through which he'd show himself to the world. He chose them as his nation. He entered into a covenant with them. And a covenant is the only kind of covenant we still have today is marriage. It's a relational commitment. He said, I will be faithful to you if you will be faithful to me. I will be your God and you will be my people. And so on the basis of that covenant, David has a relationship with God, and he at least is being faithful to that relationship in a certain sense. He doesn't measure up as far as righteousness goes, but he has this relationship with which he can plead, saying, you have made a relationship with me. I know you're righteous. I know you're faithful. And so I come to you for help. So, but there's still a problem. How does that help us? We're not Israelites, and even for the Israelites, the same problem remained. They weren't righteous. And most of the Old Testament is the record of how they were not faithful to the covenant and constantly rejected God. They lived immoral lives. They turned to other gods and the help of other nations instead of God. The biggest and most constant dilemma straight through the Bible, the hardest question, the whole Bible is trying to answer this question. How can unrighteous humans not be judged by a righteous God? We now live in an age where that problem is actually solved, because God's Son took on the form of a human, came down, and lived the only righteous human life that has ever been lived in order to solve this problem. So that his Son lived the perfect life, took the punishment that unrighteous humans who had rebelled against God deserved, so that the punishment was paid and there was righteousness that could be given or credited to us. And so, because of that, we can now have a closer relationship than even David had available to him. So this argument that he's making is actually stronger for us than it ever was for him, provided we put our faith in Jesus and rely on him for our relationship and righteous standing before God. We can come to Jesus and say, I know you paid the price for humanity on the cross, and I want to gain the benefits of your death and resurrection. I want to commit myself to you and make God my God. I want to know my Creator and be with him forever. Then God will commit himself to us if we commit ourselves to him. And we can come to him in every circumstance and seek his help and guidance, because he is our God and we are his people. And more than that, when Jesus lived on this earth, it says that in every way he was tempted like we were. He's been through everything that we've been through. He, not just by knowledge, but by experience, has been through it. So he understands what's going on. He knows what's up. And he doesn't judge us for us, because the judgment is already taken out on him. He simply wants us to come and depend on him instead of ourselves. But even if we have committed to this relationship, how often do we take advantage of it? Too often we commit ourselves to God in the beginning. It's good, it's wonderful, it's exciting. Get distracted and start drifting further and further away. All relationships take maintenance and effort, including the most important relationship, our relationship with God. In a romantic relationship, it's so easy to spend time with the person you love at the beginning. But every relationship hits a dry season, which can even last a very long time. This is often when relationships break up or marriages end in divorce. In those seasons, it's even more important to maintain the habits that you formed in the good season when the sun was shining. Spending time together is most important when it is most difficult. And it's only through maintaining the acts of love that the feelings of love can come back. Love is not a feeling. It's a choice. In the same way, a relationship with God takes effort. It's not based on a feeling. It's based on a choice. A choice to believe the Son, double entendre if you catch that, to believe the sun is still there, even when you can't feel him. A choice to seek God's face, even when you don't want to, and you doubt he's even listening. A choice to pray prayers like this one, believing that what you saw in the light is still there and still true, even in the dark. And I'm not going to lie, just like a date night would be kind of awkward when you're going through a dry season with your spouse, it's awkward spending time reading the Bible, and even more so entering into a time of prayer. But I believe it's all the more important and necessary in those times than at any other time. Admittedly, preparing for the sermon was awkward and difficult because I don't feel like a good example of a Christian. But I believe it is important so you can hear from someone who may not be feeling it, but also isn't giving up. So, let me tell you a little story. Long ago, the Vikings traveled far and wide. They made it to Iceland, they made it to Greenland, they even made it to North America in ships over 1,000 years ago. And they were able to do this because of amazing navigation abilities. They were able to, even then, figure out their latitude by taking readings on a sort of sundial device at noon. So the sun was always in the same pattern over the sky, but where it was on the horizon and where the shadow was cast on this device helped them to figure out their latitude so they could keep a straight heading west. But there was a problem with this method. There was still times when it might be overcast and foggy for days on end, and you could easily lose your course and get lost and maybe even never make it back. But they discovered even a fix for this situation. They found out that there's certain crystals that are able to catch the photons of the sun's rays even on an overcast day. And if you move it around the sky, you can find out where the sun actually is. And so once they've moved that, it's called a sunstone, that's at least what they referred to it as. Once they figured out where the sun was in the sky, they could hold up a torch in that exact position and take a reading using that artificial light, but in the same place as the sun. And in like manner, God has provided a sunstone for us. This book. It continues to give us an accurate reading of circumstances, even when our senses aren't telling us the truth. You can use your sunstone and take readings, as well as trust those readings to be true, or you'll get lost. I remember on a job, the helicopter pilot said that when whiteout conditions happened, you have to trust your readings, your instruments, rather than your senses, because in those times, left becomes right, up becomes down, and forward becomes backward. You completely lose all sense of direction, but your instruments do not. And in like manner, the Bible remains consistent and true, even when our emotions are telling us all kinds of different things that are false. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But this is always true, and we can always rely on it. So, what should we do when the sun isn't shining? Keep believing. Have faith that the sun will come out tomorrow. Seek God, and seek Him more than ever, every day. Plead with Him, argue with Him like David does in this prayer. Seek Him for direction, seek Him for deliverance, seek the deliverer Himself, and do not give up until you have Him. Gather around yourself believers to encourage you. God will be true to Himself, and those are His. I'm looking forward to a time when I can tell you the sun's shining again and that season's past. But in the meantime, I just have to believe that it's going to happen whenever it's going to happen. And if you're going through a similar season, I plead with you to do the same thing, to not give up, to keep hanging in there, to keep doing these things. And that hopefully this can be an extension of that sunstone to help you keep your heading and remain on the path. Be faithful to Him because I can guarantee that he will always be faithful to you. I just want to conclude with a couple favorite passages from other Psalms. One that's been with me through a lot of difficult times is the last few verses of Psalm 27. David says, I would have given up unless I had hoped or believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. And then again in Psalm 25, verse 3, indeed, none who wait on you, that's God, shall be put to shame. Let us close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you that you have given us the means to hold a true course in every season of life. Thank you for the gift of your word, and more the gift of your Spirit with us. And Father, I just pray for every single person here that they would have that experience of knowing you, of seeing you and experience it as the sun shining down, and know those delights and joys. But also, Father, that you would sustain them through those difficult, gloomy seasons, those days, weeks, months, even years, and that you would help them to get to the other side of those circumstances. Thank you that we have your servant David, who went through such a rough life and at the time didn't know how profitable his suffering would be to so many others who would read his prayers and know that they were not alone in their struggle and find hope to sustain them. And Father, help us, each one in our struggles, to remain faithful so that we can be another example to give others hope in their struggle. Thank you that the source of strength to sustain these seasons is always and consistently found in you, and that you are there and that you will help, and that the price has been paid so we can plead that relationship. We can have that relationship and hold it up before you, saying, do not judge your servant. Instead, deliver me and show your face again. Bring me to the other side. Thank you again for your love, and thank you for the cost of salvation that we now have through your Son. So in his alone precious and worthy and holy name, I pray all these things. Amen.